Now, today's lecture is on water and electrolyte balance and animals. And this is really important because animals, you gotta have water, right? And you have to also maintain an electrolyte balance regardless of where you're found. It doesn't matter if you're in a desert, a rainforest, living in the ocean, or even in a freshwater lake. You still have to maintain proper water and electrolyte balance. Now, why is that? Well, let's begin with water. We all know water is vital for life. In fact, I'm waiting for this new movie called Dune to come out later this year. It takes place on a desert planet, and water is life. And that makes sense, right? I mean, basically, every living organism on this planet requires water. I mean, you have to have water for life. And the reason why is because life is an emergent property of a bunch of chemical reactions. Those chemical reactions are our metabolism, building things up, breaking things down, extracting energy, getting rid of waste. You get the idea. And for our metabolism to work, it uses a lot of enzymes, those little engines of life, right? Constantly carrying out tens of thousands of reactions every single second of every single minute of every single day of our life, right? So those enzymes, well, they're optimized for temperature, pH, and guess what? Electrolyte balance. So that's important, right? And depending on the environment you're in, you may have too much water and you have to get rid of some, or you may not have enough water. You have to import it in. Now, surprisingly, as important as water is for life, we don't have any water pumps, right? There's no water pumps. There's no protein that pumps water. The way that water moves in and out of our cells is through osmosis, and the way you move water in and out of our cells is by changing water potential, by changing the electrolyte concentrations relative to the environment. But electrolytes, they're more important than just maintaining water balance inside of our cells. So the way you would do it is if you want more water inside your cells, you move more electrolytes in, you lower the water potential, water goes from high to low potential, water will move into the cell. You want to get rid of water, easy way to do it. Get rid of your electrolytes. You can allow them to leave passively, or you can pump them out. You increase the water potential inside the cell, water will exit the cell. But we also use those electrolytes to create a membrane potential. Cells are a system, and like all living things, we are out of equilibrium with our environment. And one of the ways that we do that is by maintaining a membrane potential across the cell membrane. The way you do that is, well, you change the electrolyte concentrations on either side of that membrane. And that creates, of course, an electrochemical gradient, right? So I've got, a plus charge and a minus charge across that membrane. And by having an electrochemical gradient, we store potential energy that the cell can use to do work, like move other substances in, make ATP, you name it. There's lots of things that cells can do with that. And you want to use muscles and nerves? They also depend on electrolytes. So without electrolytes, you couldn't have a nerve conduction. You couldn't send those signals rapidly from your brain to my hands. So I'm making all these hand gestures here. I couldn't have my muscles contract rapidly and then relax. All of this depends on electrolyte balance. So if you don't have proper electrolyte balance, you can get muscle cramping. You can get fatigue. You can have irregular heart rhythms, diarrhea, and even death. So maintaining electrolyte balance in animals and in us is incredibly important. So doesn't matter the environment you're in, marine environments, freshwater environments, terrestrial environments, all animals work to maintain electrolyte and water balance. And this is not even limited to animals. All life, plants, fungus, bacteria, prokaryotes, they all have to do this. So now I'm going to focus on how animal life in aquatic environments, both marine and freshwater environments, can maintain water and electrolyte balance. So now we're going to focus on how you regulate water and electrolyte balance in water, both freshwater and marine ecosystems. Now, for those of you that have never really been to an ocean, the ocean is full of sodium chloride and other salts. So it's salty. You can't drink it. So you can either be an osmoconformer or an osmoregulator. Now, of course, the osmo has to do with osmolarity, right? Whether or not you're isotonic or hypertonic or hypotonic to the environment. So osmoconformers include animals like a cnidarian. Now, cnidarians include jellyfish, corals, and sea anemones, and also these really cool things called hydrozoans, which include the Portuguese man of war. So in addition to the cnidarians, another osmoconformer are the cartilaginous fish, known as chondrichthyes. You may not be familiar with those terms, but those include sharks, skates, and rays. Now, even though they're an osmoconformer, they're still out of equilibrium with their environment. They do have different concentrations of electrolytes compared to the outside environment, but the osmolarity, right? The water potential is the same inside and outside. Now, in contrast, we have the osmoregulators, and these are the bony fish. Now, bony fish are incredibly diverse. It's like 30,000 species of bony fish, and that's the fish you're most familiar with. So these osmoregulators, these bony fish, they maintain an internal water potential that is about the same regardless if they're in freshwater or saltwater. Now that's important, right? Because if you're in a marine ecosystem, right, then the water potential is lower outside of the animal, so you're constantly losing water. If you're in a freshwater ecosystem, then water potential is lower inside the fish, and you're in constant danger of gaining water. So now the question becomes, how do these fish maintain water balance? And we'll start with the marine system. Now, these osmoregulators, they have gills. Fish have gills, right? That's how they exchange oxygen. But they also, in addition to exchanging oxygen, they can lose water by osmosis across their gills. And once again, that's because the water potential inside the fish is higher than in the marine environment. Marine environment is pretty salty. It's like 35 parts per thousand. So here's what these marine fish do. They drink lots of seawater all the time. They're constantly taking in seawater. Now, the reason why they can do that, you and I cannot. The reason why they can do that is because they have these cells called ionocytes. Cyte means cell, ion, charged particle. What these ionocytes do, and if you've been around for a while, they were once called chloride cells, they're doing active transport. These cells are loaded with mitochondria, and they are actively pumping ions out and moving ions in. In this case, it's sodium-potassium pumps. So what these ionocytes are doing is they're pumping sodium outside of the cell and pumping potassium inside the cell. You're probably going, no, wait a second. Now, why would you do that? If you're just moving one electrolyte out for another one, how is that changing your water potential? Well, a sodium-potassium pump, it's not an even exchange. You see, for every 3 sodium ions pumped out of the cell, it only pumps 2 potassium ions inside the cell. That, of course, it creates an electrochemical gradient. We know that. But because I'm also removing ions, you're also creating a net loss of ions out of the cell, right? So if you're constantly bringing in water and you're pumping these ions out, you're maintaining a higher water potential. Now you're constantly losing water. That's why the fish is constantly drinking water. Now, you're in the ocean. Let's go into a freshwater environment. I know. Very different. Now you're flipped. It's all different. The water potential inside of these fish is staying the same. But outside the fish, the water potential is now much higher because, well, freshwater doesn't have hardly any electrolytes in it. So it has very high water potential. Well, here's what happens. These freshwater fish, they don't drink water, okay? But what they do is they actively pump electrolytes into their cells. Now, by pumping electrolytes into their cells, they lower water potential. As these fish are pumping ions into their cells, and you're going, wait, that will lower water potential. That's the exact opposite of what you want to do. You're right. But the way they do it is they excrete large amounts of urine. And urine has nitrogenous waste in it, right? And nitrogenous waste will actually attract water, so it's taking that water out with it. So these fish, they're not drinking the water because they're gaining water through osmosis into their cells, but then they excrete that water in their urine. I grew up on the Gulf Coast. I grew up, fishing off of boats. And in high school, we read a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge called Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And before I read the poem, I actually didn't know it was a poem. I knew it was a 80s heavy metal song by Iron Maiden. And I loved the song because in the middle of it, and I realized in high school that this came out of the poem, which I love the poem too. It's about a sailor on the sailing ship, and he's recounting the history, the story, and they're stuck in the equator. They're stuck in the doldrums, and they're spending days there, and they're not moving, and there's no rain, and they're running out of water. And he's like, water, water everywhere, nor a drop to drink. So you could imagine that these sailors, they are dying of dehydration, and yet they are surrounded by water. And the reason why is because you and I, we don't have the ability to remove the salts from, water in the ocean. So if we were to drink salt water, it would actually just make us more dehydrated. And for those of you that like poetry, go check out Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And for any of you metalheads out there, oh yeah, you got to go check out Iron Maiden's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Fantastic song. Now, water and electrolyte balance in marine fishes. You have osmoconformers and osmoregulators. So like this little Rainford's goby, that's a bony fish. They're an osmoregulator. The whale shark, that is an osmoconformer. Now there are trade-offs to each of these strategies, right? So there's always a trade-off. There's something you can do. So the sharks, skates, and rays, these are cartilaginous fish. For those of you interested in taxonomy, they are the chondrichthyes. Their blood is isotonic to seawater. Now, this is important. It's isotonic, okay? Doesn't mean they have the exact same electrolytes as seawater. And here's a really funny story. When I was an undergraduate and I was just learning this stuff, my friend's roommate he was trying to impress somebody for dinner, and he's like, I'm going to go get shark meat. And I'm like, you don't want to do that. He said, I'm going to go cook up some shark meat. I want to impress this person. And I told my friend, don't go get shark meat. You don't want to do this because you probably don't know how to prepare it. And he's like, I'm a chef. I know how to cook. Okay. All right. So he opens up this package of shark. He was all proud of it, and it smelled like pee. And he gets really mad, and he's like, I'm going to take this back to the grocery store. This fish smells like pee. There's a reason why. And I'm sitting here laughing at him as I told him not to do this. You see, shark blood is isotonic with seawater. The way they do this is they maintain high concentrations of urea. And urea, of course, is a form of nitrogenous waste that you and I make to get rid of nitrogenous waste. You see, when we break down proteins, we create ammonia, which is incredibly toxic to us. So we convert that ammonia to urea, and then it's very water soluble, and we excrete it. Now here's the benefit. By having urea in their blood, guess what? They don't lose a lot of water by osmosis. So pretty wild. But it also means that shark meat might not smell the way you want it to smell. So I don't eat shark. Plus, we shouldn't eat sharks anyways. They've been around, modern sharks anyways, have been around for about 200 million years. Their ancestors go all the way back almost 400 million years. They've been around for a long time. And of course, this is a picture of a hammerhead shark, one of the few sharks that can actually swim that actually forms large schools. So now, okay, you're producing urea. That's nice. You're isotonic. You don't have to have all the sodium potassium pumps actively moving electrolytes. So you save energy there. But, okay, now you've got to spend energy to protect your cells from the urea. One of the reasons why we get rid of it is because, it's not good for us. it's toxic to us. So it's not too bad, but we don't want to have high concentrations of it. So sharks, rather than spending energy on sodium potassium pumps, they're spending energy protecting themselves from urea. And of course, this is a southern stingray. Those beautiful fins are actually modified pectoral fins. Think pec. This is a modified pectoral fin. And on a stingray, that's a modified pectoral fin. And the stinger is at the base of the tail, and you don't want to get stung by it. It's quite painful. Now, sharks are swimming along, and they have to excrete salt. As I told you, their blood is isotonic with the environment due to urea in it, not due to sodium chloride, which is the most common salt inside of a marine environment. So how does a shark excrete salt? Okay, this is pretty wild. Now, stay with me as we go through this. Now, sharks excrete their salt through their rectal gland. Okay, now we're going to talk about primary active transport, secondary active transport with a co-transporter, and we're going to talk about ion channels and facilitated diffusion. So let's do this. It starts with a sodium-potassium pump. Wow, have we seen sodium-potassium pumps a lot before in animals? Seems like they're used all over the place. We just saw them, for example, in both freshwater and marine fish moving electrolytes. So on this epithelial cell, that's a cell lining the rectal gland, the butt of the shark, right? You got the sodium-potassium pump. It's going to pump 2 potassium ions into the cell, and it's going to pump sodium ions outside of the cell, but not into the lumen of the gland. It's actually going to pump it back into the extracellular fluid. This is doing a couple of things. We're creating an electrochemical gradient. This is important because we're storing potential energy, which can then be used to do work. Sounds like we're going to use our co-transporter and secondary active transport. If you're thinking that, you're exactly right. What's going to happen is a co-transporter. We're going to use a sodium co-transporter. Okay, it's actually a sodium chloride potassium co-transporter. Here's how it works. As you pump sodium ions into the extracellular fluid, okay, those sodium ions are out of equilibrium with the inside of the epithelial cell, both electrically and chemically, okay? So it wants to go in equilibrium. So it's going to go through the co-transporter, and as it goes through the co-transporter, it's going to drag potassium and chloride ions with it. Now we're going to start concentrating sodium and chloride ions inside that epithelial cell, okay? So we're going to increase the concentration even more. They're getting way out of equilibrium with both the extracellular fluid and the lumen of the rectal gland, the shark butt. So now we have a chloride channel. All right. So the chloride channel, this facilitates diffusion. And what will happen is the chloride ion will then diffuse through the chloride channel. This is facilitated diffusion, and it's going to do that right into the lumen of the rectal gland, shark butt, right? And it's going to go out and then go out into the seawater. And then the sodium, okay, now we're building up sodium in the extracellular fluid, and it can actually pass through areas where the cells are connected. All right, so you're not doing any type of facilitated transport there, but the sodium ions can actually go in between these cells. So now we're getting rid of sodium chloride. The chloride's exiting, of course, through the chloride ion, and the sodium ion is leaving between the cells. We're getting rid of salt. There's one other channel, and that's a potassium ion channel that allows potassium to diffuse down its concentration gradient back into the extracellular fluid, where it will then get pumped in by the sodium potassium pump and by the sodium chloride potassium co-transporter. Okay, that's a lot, right? So that's how sharks can actually remove sodium chloride from themselves and not build up too much salt inside them, even though they're constantly drinking it. So a good way to make sure you understand this is to basically follow sodium. What's its route? And then once you follow the sodium ion, Where are the potassium ions and the chloride ions going? Okay, so that's how sharks excrete salt. Once again, another use of all of our different types of transport in cells. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite fish, the mullet, the striped mullet. No, I know, I didn't even know that the mullet was called a haircut until I went to college in the early 90s. I thought a mullet was how you were supposed to cut your hair. Keep it kind of long in the back and, short in the front. Business in the front, party in the back with the long hair, but it would protect your neck from the sun, right? Well, at any rate, mullet. Now, some people consider mullet bait. Some people consider it a fine delicacy. Only a very small number of people do that. But most people don't consider it anything. But it is a really cool fish to talk about water and electrolyte balance. You see, mullet can actually go into freshwater and then swim back out into the marine environment. They can go both ways, right? So that's really cool. So that means something's happening with these fish that allow them to swim up the rivers and then back out into the Gulf again. So how does it do this? Remember that marine fish are in danger of losing water, and freshwater fish are in danger of gaining water. And so depending on the environment, the fish is either drinking water, marine systems, or they're in a freshwater environment, they're not drinking fish, but they're peeing a lot out, right? They're excreting it as urine. So the way that we think this works is you flip the orientation of your ionocytes. Now, how a fish like a mullet or any other fish that switches between a freshwater and marine environment, how they're able to do that, we're still studying it. We're still trying to figure it out. And each one of these different types of fish, whether you're a mullet or a sheep's head or any of these fish that are switching between these environments, they may have actually evolved the ability to do this independently and come up with different solutions. So they may be using slightly different mechanisms, but either way, what they're doing is they're switching around how they're moving the electrolytes either into or out of their cells, and whether or not they're drinking water, not drinking water, or urinating a lot. So, hey, this is another thing that we could actually study. And it's amazing that some fish can do that. And you can also imagine that there's an upper limit of how salty the water can be for fish, because the saltier the water is, the more in danger the fish is of losing their water and the more energy they have to spend. So there are these really cool fish called a pupfish. And there's one in San Salvador, way out in the Bahamas, that can actually live in almost 70 to 80 parts per thousand saltwater. That's twice seawater. So you can imagine that these fish actually spend a lot of energy maintaining water by keeping water inside of them. So now I hope you have a better understanding of how fish can regulate water and electrolyte balance in both marine and freshwater environments. Until next time.